Squaresoft was at their creative peak during their time developing games for the PlayStation in the 1990s. Their experimentation with genres and game design led to some of their most interesting and visually striking games that, to this day, the tremors are still felt. Influences can be seen in endless indie games and Squaresoft's own competitors as they try to capture the magic that only 90s Squaresoft can manage. The Mana series has always been a fan favorite, yet it's been something that very few developers have wanted to copy. At its core, the franchise has been a high fantasy action RPG with local co-op options, and a narrative that emphasizes the importance of ecology. This was always the case with the entries on the SNES, Secret of Mana and Trials of Mana, the other two games most people associate with the series. During the experimental days of the first PlayStation, Squaresoft decided to follow up on the Mana games with a new sequel that would push the boundaries of sprite work for the genre, and design gameplay that would allow freedom in a style that wouldn't become standard for over a decade. At the time, gamers didn't know what to make of it. Now, with M2 handling a remaster, hopefully everyone can appreciate one of Squaresoft's underrated gems. A core pillar of every Mana game is the theme of the environment. This was the series founded on Gaia theory, the idea that the Earth itself and all of its biological mechanisms operate as a single entity. A crucial aspect of this theory is that the planet has a self-correcting feedback loop that keeps the planet and all life on it in check. Self-correction can take many forms, whether it's a natural disaster or apocalyptic extinction event. Legend of Mana's thematic foundation is built upon the death and rebirth of life, an endless harmonized cycle. For some, this may lead to an existential crisis, but in Legend of Mana, business goes on as usual. With themes like this, it could be easy to assume that Legend of Mana will have a heavy and deep story to carry these ideas. Unfortunately, that's not what you're going to get. An overwhelming majority of the experience is doing episodic side stories within an open-ended setting. There's a main arc that does follow a traditional narrative structure, a few of them in fact. However, the actual plots are very thin, and it's very likely that most of it will go unseen on the first playthrough. Legend of Mana can be very cryptic on how it can be played. Event triggers are undefined, and the lack of hand-holding makes most of the playtime meandering around trying to figure out what to do next. One of the major arcs centers around a murderous jewel thief and being tasked with tracking down and identifying the culprit. This story has a great climax, but the surrounding events of this scenario are such a small part of the experience, which is so much more mundane. This can lead to some very boring gameplay because there is barely a defined goal. Thankfully, the light atmosphere is pleasant and the setting is beautifully realized. The backdrops have been sharpened and polished up in a big way, showing off how the artists possibly envisioned the world. Background art was always a reliable and efficient means to make worlds look and feel believable. Legend of Mana is no exception, and 90s Squaresoft brought in some of the best talent to illustrate the setting. Everything is so rich and lush with color. The design style is bursting with personality and appealing slopes and angles. Lighting is given great care to make every location feel as inviting as possible. Each backdrop can be stared at for hours to pick apart details. You might even find yourself wondering how nice it would be to live there. The drawback to the sharp and remastered background art is that M2 did not fully explore their options, and don't offer a means to have pixel art interpretation. The character sprites are numerous and impressively varied, but have been left untouched in their rarest form. These sprites were designed to be seen on a CRT display so that their pixels would easily bleed together. The harsh edges were not intended, and seeing them in HD goes against the organic aesthetic of the game. This is especially noticeable with the characters juxtaposed against those newly remastered backgrounds. The crisp and jagged pixelated characters clash and stick out way more than they should in Legend of Mana Remastered. On the original PlayStation version, this was not an issue due to the way all the visuals were unified by the limitations of the hardware. It's distracting, but after a while some people may be able to adjust to the incongruence of the assets. Some improvements were made that are welcomed, like the widescreen aspect ratio, which takes advantage of the expansive horizons and lengthy cavernous dungeon. Bosses make a statement with their enormous girth. Their expressive gestures and range of movement make them seem unpredictable. Even so, they have very long windups which trivialize most of the challenges they could offer. Most of the time, battles are won by exploiting the pathetic enemy AI and abusing the overly generous stun locking. Since the animation is not the most fluid and keyframes are lingered on for a fraction of a second more than necessary, It's so easy to time attacks between iframes to steamroll through most battles. Bosses are especially a pushover due to most of them being alone. Basic battles offer a bit more of a fight because encounters tend to have multiple threats, and the player is only able to hit one at a time. Even if several enemies bunch up together, swinging a greatsword will only count hits for one of the enemies. While the aimless adventuring and questing may be kind of dull within a certain mindset, the combat is truly the downfall of Legend of Mana. The fighting is about as complex as the earliest beat-em-ups on 8 and 16-bit consoles, and in some cases is inferior. Movement is stiff, and strikes lack punch when they connect. Evasive maneuvers are extremely limited because players have to choose prior to battle if they want to have a counterattack, block, or about 3 to 4 different kinds of dodges. Only 2 can be mapped to 2 of the buttons, and using both slots means losing the ability to jump. This harsh restriction makes most battles boring and lifeless. There's so little to do, and most of the time the heroes will simply well the opposition over the head with the best available weapon. There's no need to play carefully either, since all health is restored after the battle, which deflates all tension while exploring. The different weapon types are all worth using because each one will lead to the protagonist learning new abilities associated with that specific weapon. This is one of the more thoughtfully designed aspects of the combat, since this encourages players to diversify their playstyles. Sadly, the weapon upgrading system is as convoluted as it ever was back in 1999. When it opens up, the feature is barely explained and the in-game tutorials aren't very helpful. Not that it matters much since Legend of Mana is already extremely easy, but having a more powerful weapon does help ease the tedium of chipping away a massive boss's life bar. It's not difficult to make it all the way to the end of the playthrough and never upgrade a single weapon. The one saving grace of the Comatose combat is that it can be played cooperatively. This does make encounters more exciting, and like karaoke, everything's more fun with friends. The second player will assume the role of one of the many supporting cast members. This can range from the lovably scummy Nicolo the Rabbit, who is barely armed, to the axe-wielding beastman Lark. There are several who become available and rotate as the stories unfold, which makes them feel like they're their own person. They have their own lives, and the player is just another person in their world, not the other way around. There's also a light monster raising sim mechanic that was borderline useless in the original release, but thanks to the restoration of the minigame Ring Land, players can raise extremely powerful allies from an egg. The minigame itself is mostly pure blind luck, and is nothing interesting, but fans of Legends of Mana who never owned a Pocket Station will be able to cross this one off their bucket list. Meeting these characters and participating in their stories is a bulk of what makes Legend of Mana. A lot of the time it feels like different episodes of a slice of life within a fantasy setting. Since the game's structure is so freeform and there are consequences for making certain decisions in a certain order, it's unlikely to experience what Legend of Mana has to offer in a single playthrough. This game is built around New Game Plus and doing things differently to try different outcomes. This makes replay value high, but you already have to have an acquired taste to appreciate what this game has to offer. Yoko Shimomura does an amazing job as always, with her impeccable music. Legend of Mana might be her best work, and shows a large range of styles and emotions with her composition. The town music feels very homely and inviting. Getting into boss battles sounds the electric guitars and fast shredding to inspire aggression. The main theme is especially memorable, and has some cues that seem like they would be the basis for what Shimomura would go on to create for Kingdom Hearts. Both the original PlayStation arrangement and a new remastered score is present. While the remastered music sounds quite good, anyone who grew up with the Legend of Mana is going to prefer the original sound's warmth. Im2 did the best they could with Legend of Mana Remastered. The original game was far from perfect, and this new version's visuals may not sit well with everyone. But quality of life features like saving anywhere and Ring Land being saved makes some of the concessions worth it. Turning off basic encounters is an option too. But what this remastered needed was a mini-map for the maze-like dungeons that recycle the same few background assets. In conclusion, Legend of Mana Remastered is a decent entry-level action RPG for children thanks to its easy combat and seemingly wholesome setting. Various dialects characters speak in make for amusing readings with kids, and the simple co-op action is easily understood. Since the plot is so light and focuses on short sub-stories, The scenarios are easily followed and digestible.